All right. Now that we've discussed what rhetoric is and how it's part of our lives and in the world all around us, and we've become familiar with some key rhetorical terms, especially for the rhetorical situation, now it's time to really get into the nitty-gritty of how rhetoric works in text. This week we're focusing specifically on written text, linguistic, spoken, um, anything dealing with the language, rhetoric with that. And next week we'll move on to talk about visual rhetoric. When you analyze your ads for your rhetorical analysis paper, you'll have to analyze both the text on the ad and the visual elements of the ad. So that's why we're talking about both sides of it. Both are very important. Now, most ads these days don't tend to have too much text in them, whereas this week we will be analyzing longer speeches, longer texts, but this is still really useful life skill to know how to look at any text of any length and determine the rhetorical moves it's making. So I do want to pause here for a minute and give you a definition of the word analysis. You're writing a rhetorical analysis. We've spent a lot of time talking about what rhetoric means, but what exactly does analysis mean? To me, there are two parts to analysis. The first part is identification, right? You must identify the parts. You break it down into its pieces. The second part, and to me the most important, honestly, is explaining the significance of those parts to the whole. You can't just point out the parts, although that is half the battle. Half the battle is pointing out the parts. But you also need to explain why those parts matter. So today, we're going to learn how to identify parts of written rhetoric, parts of written strategies. But like I said, identifying is only the first half. The real goal in your analysis is going to be making those parts significant, pointing out what is significant about them to the whole piece. Now, your textbook gave you a fine example of rhetorically analyzing an article about social media shaming. It was a fantastic analysis, and I hope you read through all of that really carefully. Today, I'm going to walk you through some written strategies, which are also often called rhetorical tools or rhetorical moves. Now, I want you to take notes on these on your terms sheet. So make sure that your term sheet is open and you're taking notes on all of these written strategies. So there are hundreds, possibly even thousands, of named rhetorical strategies or tools or moves. Scholars back in Shakespeare's day, oh here, look, see, I've got a list here. This is just 71 of a fresh from a top Google search. There are really hundreds more. And scholars back in Shakespeare's day used to have to memorize these long lists of rhetorical tools and spend a huge amount of time identifying very specific moves in other writing and then try to imitate it in their own writing. I'm not expecting you to learn and identify things like chiasmus or anaphorisms or whatever, any of these really nitty-gritty things. But I do want you to be aware that there are hundreds of these that are called rhetorical tools, rhetorical moves, rhetorical strategies, however you want to phrase it. You do need to know some of them, a handful of them. You need to be paying attention to the way texts work, and whether you can name it or not, be aware that the text structure is having a rhetorical effect. Mostly, I want you to be paying attention so that when you read a text, anything that makes you feel or think something, you identify that as working rhetorically. So whenever something in a text makes you stop and go, oh, that was really cleverly said, or that was funny, or oh, that makes me think, or that was beautifully said, those are underlying rhetorical strategies at work. So in this PowerPoint, I'm just going to cover a handful of some of the more key terms. the easier to grasp rhetorical strategies. And then we will use a speech at the end to apply these terms and show you how to do a basic rhetorical analysis. So many of these strategies were canvassed in your textbook. A few at the end weren't. So I want you to take notes on all of them though, so make sure your note sheet is out. Okay, first, we have the idea of sequence, all right? These are words or structures that help organize the text for you, either organized by time or by importance or some other facet. These are going to, whenever you see words in a text like first, before, preceding, then, after, following, next, finally, last, those create a rhetorical effect by drawing attention to the event, thing, or process, by helping the audience picture in their head or conceptualize these categories and how they're related to each other or how things are working in time. So if you see words like that, pay attention to them and pay attention to what they're doing to the audience, for the audience, in helping organize the text. Next, we have comparison and contrast. This happens anytime you describe how something is like or different from something else, although there can be distinctions there once we get into talking about similes and metaphors. So comparisons and contrasts are going to use words like, similarly, as well, unlike, in contrast, opposed to, instead of, different from, while, instead of, either or, however, etc., right? Uh, that's comparing and contrasting. This calls the audience's attention to the qualities of a thing by comparing it to something that they might be more familiar with, or just helping to draw connections. So if you see words like this, definitely pay attention to them and what they're doing to organize concepts in a text. Okay, next we have description. And this can be fairly simple. This is providing more detailed information about something. Anytime you see keywords like for example, in particular, for instance, such as, most importantly, another, etc. Anything that's descriptive in nature, is having a rhetorical effect. It's calling attention to the details of something, perhaps trying to persuade the audience to understand it more, or to form a stronger connection to it. All right, now we need to talk about cause and effect. Cause and effect lays out a logical chain of consequences, all right? So if you're thinking about appealing to logos, cause and effect is part of an appeal to logos. It might talk about what made something happen or the results of a particular occurrence. This is going to use keywords anytime you see keywords like because, thus, due to, therefore, as a result of, the effects of, the reason being, caused, for these reasons, if X then Y, etc. Those are keywords to pay attention to that are demonstrating cause and effect. Cause and effect attempts to persuade the audience to accept the author's view of reality and to view things rationally and logically. All right, let's talk about problem and solution. Okay, this is where the text will introduce a problem or set something up as being a problem, and then potentially offering a solution to it. This is also an appeal to logos, by helping the audience think logically in terms of problems and solutions. So keywords for this rhetorical move is going to be the problem is, the challenge, if X then Y, which was also mentioned in cause and effect, therefore, difficult, but the solution is, etc. So this makes an implicit appeal to the audience about how things should be, aims to persuade them that something isn't right and that it should or could be made right. Right? That's how problem solution is working. So lots of appeals to logos so far. This next page, we're talking about sometimes they're called literary figures, but they are also can be referred to as rhetorical figures. And these are the ones, like I said, we could go on and on and on and list hundreds and hundreds of these types of figures. I'm just bringing up a handful of few that are going to be important as we look through our speech in the next slide. Um, so these ones, the rhetorical purpose of these can be manifold, but a lot of the time it's about pleasure, inducing pleasure, or making, or it building a sense of ethos, of trust in the skill of the creator. Because clearly, if they're using things like this, they're very skillful with their language. So appeals to pathos, appeals to ethos going on here with literary and rhetorical figures. So these are going to be things like a simile and a metaphor, right? Hopefully you already know what those are, but comparisons that either help elucidate or they're simply pleasing. Similes and metaphors are very common and very powerful, very, very powerful. This can also be repetition. We saw this in the Winston Churchill speech, repeating a word or a phrase to emphasize or build emotion. Repetition can be very powerful. If done poorly, repetition can be very bad, very, very bad. But if done well, it can be really powerful. Okay, then there's parallelism. This is when a word or a grammatical construction is repeated or mirrored to suggest a connection through an echo of form. Okay, if that didn't make sense, we're going to look at an example of it in just a second. So it's not quite the same as repetition, but it can still be really have a really interesting rhetorical effect. Then we have allusion. Allusion is when you refer to another usually well-known text or event, historical event or social event or cultural knowledge thing, to draw a comparison or to make the audience think of values associated with that text or event or whatever it is, just alluding to something else. We're going to see an example of that in just a moment too. Alliteration. I love alliteration. Alliteration is using several consonants of the same sound, generally just for the pleasing effect on the ear. And then hyperbole is the last one I'm going to mention. That's when you exaggerate for effect. And like I said, this is just a handful, just a few. If you're familiar with more, then keep an eye out for them in the text that we look at this week. But what we're going to do right now is actually analyze a text for some of its written rhetorical features. So we have here the Gettysburg Address, which hopefully most of you are at least passingly familiar with. This speech may be short, but it is packed with rhetorical strategy, which is why it's so powerful and still so popular. So I'm just going to point out a very few handful of strategies that are used here. First, you'll see highlighted here, we have the phrase 7 years ago. This is a marker of time, of organization, and it is also an allusion, or referring at least back to a previous point in history. And it is set up in contrast with now, the word now. So the contemporary time. So he's sequencing events, President Lincoln's sequencing events, and making a comparison and a contrast between the historical moment of the founding of the United States and the struggle that they're facing at the moment, which is the Civil War. So he is setting up that comparison and contrast by mentioning this sequence of time. 7 years ago, that phrase is also, it's an archaic phrase and it's biblical language. So it's a slight allusion to the Bible, which is building up a sense of ethos or credibility, also a sense of importance for the moment that we're using, really formal biblical language here. So right off the bat, we're starting with some rhetorical strategies. Next, let's take a look at this phrase here. All men are created equal. This is also an allusion to the Declaration of Independence. So this is more throwing back to the founding of the country, more building up of that comparison between the founding time and this momentous Civil War time as sort of these two really key moments in the nation's history. And also, all men are created equal. that hint to the Declaration of Independence, drawing on those values that the country was built on. All right, we're going to jump down here to this phrase. So, as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. All right, this is not a perfect, but a decent example of a parallelism. So we have these parallel concepts of the men who gave their lives that the nation might live. It's drawing that connection, that parallel between the lives of men and the life of the nation. The men have to give their lives so that the nation will live, right? All right, here, two little rhetorical pieces I want to talk about. First, the word but, right? Talk about words like this being key rhetorical features. What we know here is that this is going to be a turn, right? So he's turning from what he was talking about before, and he's going to introduce a new concept. So phrases like and, or, but, those are key rhetorical phrases, keys to the audience that we're at a turning point of emphasis. All right, next let's talk about right here. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. All right, that is repetition, right? And it is repetition that's building emphasis of a negative. We cannot, we cannot, we cannot, right? Sort of, so build some emphasis there. Let's jump down and take a look just briefly here. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget. Also, just a slight emphasis of this, but this is alliteration. The N sound is repeated 3 times in this sentence. It's a slight thing, but it's kind of just there to make it sound nice, right? Make it flow easily off the tongue. That's what alliteration does. All right, let's take a look at this phrase down here. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. This is another parallelism, right? We take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. The word devotion is repeated, but it's parallelism between we are taking increased devotion because of what these soldiers, because of the devotion that the soldiers gave. So creating parallels between what the soldiers gave to what the people hearing the speech need to do now. They gave the devotion, we take the devotion. You see how that's a parallelism? All right, and then finally at the end here, we have that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Okay, lots of things going on here. First, we have more allusion back to the founding, back to the Constitution, right? This phrasing here is alluding back to the Constitution, we the people, right? So we're tying it back again to the founding of the country, which and all of that ethos that builds. And then again, we also have that repetition, and it's like Lincoln's really brilliant at this use of repetition. Of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Like that repetition really builds up emphasis to that final moment. Super powerful. It's super powerful here. All right, that was just a handful, okay? We could go back through and in every sentence, if not every word of this speech, we could pick out more detailed rhetorical techniques. But remember, identifying is only half the battle, right? What we need to do now is talk about what's the significance? What's the point of being able to say, oh, he used alliteration here. Oh, that's an allusion. Well, the point is that all of these things serve the overall purpose of his speech. They make the audience think about the founding of the country. They make the audience think about values and emotions, strong emotions that appeal to pathos. And they're phrased beautifully, which gives pleasure and makes us think that Lincoln is intelligent and a good speaker. Allusions to the Bible and God make us think of moral rightness, and repetition builds emphasis so that we get that point. We feel inspired. We feel the justness of the cause, the importance of the war, the importance of the sacrifice. And finally, we feel hope, right? The overall purpose and message of this speech is hope. That's the point. Hope in the nation, hope in the cause, hope that the cost is worth it. All right, so all of these things are building up to serve the overall purpose. Okay, now it's your turn. Good luck with your own textual analyses.